I should have thought this through. I didn't want you all to hurt. Now everyone's in pain and I'm lying in the dirt. People are asking, why did he do it? Only I know where it began. Now it is over. Gone too young.
For decades, our First Nations Australians have continued to die by suicide at 2.5 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. For our children, it gets much worse. Staggeringly, when an Indigenous child dies in this country, 40% of them do so by suicide.
Now, I lost my daughter, maybe seven years old, and I'm still going through that pain and that hard time. We need someone local, someone that understands Aboriginal culture, that can talk in a cultural language. There's no cultural barrier, but there's always someone there to help.
The system has been built by non-Indigenous people to meet the needs of non-Indigenous people. It is therefore unsurprising that this approach has failed, and it has failed our most vulnerable.
And I had no assistance, no tools, no solutions, no anything. That person was just could not believe and fathom in their lifetime that this would happen to somebody.
If you actually understand what it's like to walk in an Aboriginal person's shoes, then empathy, the core constructs of counselling, which is empathy, becomes a lot easier. It's a lot more natural. You don't need to have racism explained to you because you've lived it.
They're dealing with what is a completely unacceptable rate of child suicide in the Aboriginal community. This is one of the best opportunities we have of ensuring that those in our high-risk communities have access to specialist services which they need.
I'll never forget that day. Especially them other kids screaming and crying and just crying to help her.
Indeed, 4 successive government inquiries, the most recent of which was the Fogliani Inquiry into the 13 deaths by suicide of Aboriginal young people in the Kimberley, concluded that most of these children died as a result of system failure or a lack of access to culturally appropriate services. We know that only 6% of Indigenous Australians in critical mental health need will access mental health support. Our children should not be dying from want in a world of excess. We have just 218 Indigenous psychologists out of the 30,000 psychologists in this country. With prevalence of mental ill health in the general population at 20%, this means that for every Indigenous psychologist, there are at least 1,000 Indigenous people who are in mental health crisis.
Suicide was the leading cause of death for Indigenous children in 2018. They made up close to 25% of all youth suicides, despite being just 5% of the child population. It's estimated 1 in 3 Aboriginal young people experience psychological distress, compared to 1 in 8 in the general population.
Jilya is meeting this challenge head-on. Based on 2 decades of evidence, the Jilya model has been developed by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. We know the Jilya model works. Jilya was established by a small group of volunteers led by Dr Tracy Westerman AM to ensure that future generations do not continue to suffer from this unacceptable neglect as a result of a lack of treatment access. In just 12 months, Jilya is supporting and mentoring 25 Indigenous psychologists in culturally and clinically informed best practice across the nation, who will in turn go back to their communities to address what has become one of our nation's greatest crises.
Dr Tracy Westerman, scholarships, please.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Thank you so much. I'm actually starting to cry.
Oh, you're so beautiful.
There's so much that you could learn from Tracy. very meaningful, and the fact that it's needed, especially in our community now. We're having high suicide rates, and a lot of elders don't understand, and even community members are still trying to find answers.
The work you did in Derby with those young people and with the families of Derby in a time when we were in crisis. Young people were suiciding. Young people came from far and wide. It was Bulb Festival time. A lot was going on, and yet the workshops that was being done, we had young people coming more and more each day to be a part of this amazing workshop that was being done